Imagine losing everything you love, without any explanation, and no chance to turn back. That's exactly what happened to Kevin, a young boy born in Haiti, separated from his twin brother David at a young age. What if you discovered a missing piece of your life after years of wondering? Stay with African Legacy Tales to uncover this incredible story of loss, reunion, and the unthinkable truth that changed everything. While David grew up in comfort and luxury in the United States, Kevin had to fight to survive in a forgotten orphanage, always searching for answers that seemed out of reach. But after years apart, fate brings them face to face again. What would you do if you suddenly stood in front of someone who felt like a stranger, but triggered a memory buried deep inside? Can you imagine looking into the eyes of someone who shares your face, yet a completely different life? Stick with African Legacy Tales to find out what happens next. The moment their eyes meet, something shifts, and the truth that's been hidden for so long finally begins to come out. What they discover will shake everything they thought they knew about their lives. But are they ready to face it? Stay with me until the end, because you don't want to miss what happens next on African Legacy Tales. Kevin and David were born in Haiti, a country that always seemed on the brink of a new storm. Kevin and David's parents lived in a small village, struggling day by day to keep their family afloat amid the misery surrounding them. Life was never easy for them. Their father, Jean, worked long hours in the fields, barely earning enough to bring food to the table. Their mother, Marie, took care of the home and cared for the twins with all the love she could offer in such a tough environment. Despite the hardships, both clung to the hope of giving their children a better life, a life beyond the poverty and chaos that marked the fate of so many in their country. But Haiti was far from being a stable place. Local conflicts, often fueled by political or territorial disputes, were common. The small village where Jean and Marie lived was not exempt from this violence. They often heard rumors of armed groups moving through the rural areas, and although they tried to stay away from trouble, they couldn't avoid living under the constant shadow of fear. It was only a matter of time before the violence reached them. The day their world crumbled began like any other. Jean had left early for work, and Marie was taking care of Kevin and David, who at that time were just 1 year old. As the day went on, the tension in the air became palpable. By evening, a group of armed men stormed the village, claiming land and attacking anyone who tried to resist. Jean was one of the first to confront the intruders, trying to protect his home, but the conflict was brief and brutal. Jean fell under the attackers' fire, and Marie, in an attempt to escape with the twins, was also struck down. The twins miraculously survived the attack, but their lives changed forever that day. After the tragedy, Kevin and David were taken to a nearby orphanage. They were too young to understand the magnitude of what had happened, too small to remember the details of that day, but life in the orphanage offered no comfort. Resources were scarce, and the caregivers had little time to worry about the children's emotions. A few months after arriving at the orphanage, a wealthy family from the United States visited, looking to adopt. They took an interest in David, one of the twins, and without looking back, decided to take him away. Kevin didn't understand what was happening, but immediately felt the absence of his brother as he watched them separate him from his side. That night, Kevin cried inconsolably, calling for his brother with the few babbles he knew. He didn't understand why David wasn't there, or why no one was comforting him. The following nights were no different. Kevin continued to cry, his little heart feeling a pain he couldn't comprehend or express fully. He called for David in the dark, hoping he would return, but the answer never came. The caregivers, tired of his crying, began to scold him, trying to make him stop being a problematic child. As days and weeks passed, Kevin's memory of David began to fade. At first, his brother's absence consumed him. He felt lost, incomplete, not really understanding why. However, over time, he stopped crying. Little by little, his young mind began to forget David's face, his laughter, and the sensation of having someone by his side. Not because he wanted to forget, but because his tender age and the routine of the orphanage pushed him to adapt to the reality he lived. The emptiness he felt did not go away, although he could no longer pinpoint why. Kevin continued to feel a sense of loss, as if something essential had been taken from him. He couldn't name it, couldn't describe it, but that void remained within him, a kind of silent sadness that accompanied him as he grew up in the orphanage. Time and distance had blurred the details of his brother, but the feeling that something important was missing from his life never completely faded. With each passing day, Kevin learned to live without David. The memories grew hazy, as if the separation had been part of a distant dream, something that happened so long ago that it no longer seemed real. Yet, deep within him, something remained broken. David, on the other hand, was taken to a life that many children could only imagine. From the moment he arrived in the United States, his new home, a luxurious mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, became his world. His adoptive parents, both from a wealthy and well-connected family, welcomed him with open arms and surrounded him with everything money could buy. He had his own room, expensive toys, designer clothes, and an education that prepared him to be someone important. At first glance, it seemed like David had it all. He grew up in an environment of absolute comfort, the best schools, private tutors, and a social life that kept him surrounded by friends and extracurricular activities. His parents, always attentive to ensure he lacked nothing, enrolled him in the best programs, making sure he had access to all possible opportunities. As a child, David was the center of attention at family gatherings and social events, always well-dressed, always praised for his polite behavior and intelligence. As he grew, David excelled in school. He was a brilliant student, consistently earning top grades. His academic performance not only pleased his parents but also promised him a bright future. Socially, he was successful as well. He had a wide circle of friends, participated in important events, and was considered a charming young man. To everyone around him, David had a perfect life, the life anyone would wish for. However, despite all the success and opportunities, there was something inside him that didn't quite fit. From a young age, David began to feel a kind of emptiness, an inexplicable sense that something was missing. He didn't understand where that feeling came from. He had everything, why couldn't he feel complete? As a child, he thought it was just a phase, something temporary, but as the years passed, that emptiness only deepened. It was a strange feeling. Sometimes, when he was surrounded by friends, laughing and joking, there would be a moment when he felt disconnected, as if he were physically present but his mind was somewhere else. That feeling of lack silently pursued him without any apparent cause. There were nights when he would wake up in the dark of his room, his heart racing, and he wouldn't know why. David could only feel that something was wrong, something that neither all the money nor all the love from his adoptive parents could resolve. David never spoke about this with anyone. How could he explain something he didn't even understand himself? His adoptive parents had always been good to him. They treated him with affection and gave him everything he needed. They never made him feel out of place. To them, David was part of the family from the moment they adopted him, and out of respect, he never mentioned that something was missing. However, no matter how much he tried to convince himself that his life was perfect, that feeling of loss lingered. It was like a shadow that followed him everywhere, always appearing when he least expected it. When he saw other families, he sometimes wondered if he had ever had siblings, if he had ever known his biological family. He couldn't remember anything about his life in Haiti. He didn't even have images of his first months of life. But deep within him, there was a part that knew there was more, something that had been left behind. At school, David excelled in everything he did, but even with each achievement, the satisfaction he should have felt never fully arrived. On the outside, his classmates saw him as the kid who had it all, good grades, a wealthy family, a secured future. But David only saw the shadows of what he didn't understand, of what he felt was missing. Sometimes, when he was alone in his room, he would look out the window at the immaculate gardens and wonder why he couldn't feel truly happy. There were times when neither parties, activities, nor school awards could fill that void. Something was missing, but he couldn't describe it or explain it. In those lonely nights, David felt a nostalgia for something he didn't even remember having lost. The emptiness was like an invisible wound, one that didn't bleed or hurt physically but was always there, reminding him that his life was not as complete as it seemed. It wasn't a matter of having more things or achieving more. David had learned over time that what he lacked was not material but something deeper, something related to his own identity, to his roots. But how could he search for what he didn't know existed? How could he explain this emptiness to himself when his life appeared perfect on the surface? As the years passed, that feeling didn't disappear, and although he grew accustomed to living with it, he knew that one day he would have to confront it. Because no matter how hard he tried, the emptiness he felt never stopped reminding him that somewhere, a part of his life was lost, waiting to be found. While David grew up surrounded by luxury in the United States, Kevin lived a completely different reality in Haiti. From the day his brother was adopted and disappeared from his life, Kevin had to learn to survive on his own. The orphanage where he spent his childhood was humble, barely a place where children received the basics to survive. Food was scarce, the caregiver's attention was almost non-existent, and affection was nowhere to be found. For Kevin, life had always been a struggle, and from a young age, he understood that he couldn't expect anything from anyone. If he wanted to get ahead, he would have to do it by himself. He was never adopted. While other children were taken by families, Kevin remained at the orphanage, watching as those he shared his days with disappeared one by one. At first, he looked longingly at the couples visiting, hoping that somehow they would choose him too. But over time, he stopped looking. He knew he wouldn't be picked. Families were looking for younger, easier-to-manage children. As Kevin grew older and more aware of his situation, he was left alone. One afternoon, while helping to clear the plates after dinner, one of the caregivers, Mr. Antoine, approached him and looked at him silently. Antoine was an older man, weary from life in the orphanage, and although he wasn't cruel, he wasn't kind either. "Kevin, do you have any plans for the future?" Antoine asked, breaking the silence that always enveloped the nights in the orphanage. Kevin, surprised by the question, paused for a moment before responding. "I don't know, Mr. Antoine," he said, looking down at the plates in his hands. "I've never thought about it. No one here thinks about the future." Antoine let out a sigh. He knew that Kevin wasn't like the other children. There was something about him, a strength that not many possessed in that place. "You have to think about the future, boy," Antoine said, placing a hand on Kevin's shoulder. "This place isn't forever. Sooner or later, you'll have to leave here, and when you do, you'll need more than your hands to survive." Kevin looked Antoine in the eyes, trying to decipher if there was a lesson in his words. He knew Antoine was right, but until that moment, his life had only been a succession of the same days, with no space to think about what would come next. "And what should I do?" Kevin finally asked, a mix of curiosity and resignation in his voice. Antoine looked at him for a moment before responding. "Work hard, save what you can, and if you have a dream, don't let it die in here." That brief dialogue stuck in Kevin's mind for the following years. While he continued working at the orphanage, helping in the kitchen, cleaning, and doing whatever was necessary to earn the caregiver's favor, those words reverberated in his head. As he grew, he began to visualize a dream: going to the United States. He had heard about the opportunities that country offered, the stories of people who managed to get ahead, and Kevin decided that would be his goal. He didn't know how he would do it, but he was determined to succeed. By the time he turned 20, Kevin had saved enough. He was working wherever he could, from helping in small local businesses to construction jobs. Every coin he earned, he saved carefully, knowing that one day that money would allow him to leave Haiti. His companions at the orphanage, the few who remained, looked at him curiously. One night, while resting after a long day of work, his friend Samuel, one of the few who also grew up in the orphanage, sat beside him. "I heard you plan to go to the United States," Samuel said with a mix of disbelief and admiration. Kevin nodded, looking at the horizon where the town lights shone in the distance. "Yes, I've worked hard for this. I want a better life." Samuel looked at him in silence for a few moments before speaking. "Aren't you afraid?" he asked. "It's an unknown place. You don't know anyone there. What if things don't go as you expect?" Kevin thought for a moment. Fear was something he had learned to ignore a long time ago. Growing up in the orphanage had taught him not to expect much from life, but it had also given him a strength that few possessed. "I'm scared," Kevin admitted, turning his gaze to Samuel, "but staying here and doing nothing scares me more. I'd rather fail trying something than die knowing I never tried." That was the last meaningful conversation he had before leaving. Soon after, with his ticket in hand, Kevin left Haiti. He boarded the plane with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Finally, he was taking the first step toward the life he had always dreamed of. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but after everything he had been through, difficulty didn't intimidate him. When Kevin arrived in the United States, the cultural shock and challenges he faced were immediate. He didn't speak the language well, had no education, and no context to help him find a good job. All he knew was hard work and sacrifice. The first days on American soil were chaotic. The noise of the streets, the fast pace of life, and the language barrier made every daily task feel like a challenge. Kevin had to start from the bottom. With few qualifications and no formal experience, he took the first job that was offered to him, a position in construction. The hours were long and exhausting, with his hands blistered and his body aching by the end of the day. However, he never complained. He knew he was building something, even if it was with bricks and cement, and that every dollar he earned brought him closer to the stability he longed for. After several months in construction, an unexpected opportunity arose when one of his co-workers mentioned that a wealthy family was looking for someone to care for their gardens. Kevin, who had worked in the fields in Haiti since he was a child, knew how to work the land, how to prune, and how to keep plants alive. Although he had no formal landscaping experience, he decided to give it a shot. When he arrived at the family's property, a massive mansion surrounded by neglected gardens, Kevin saw the potential. With the tools they provided and the few instructions he received, he began working on the overgrown bushes and plants that had been abandoned. He spent hours under the sun, digging, pruning, and shaping the garden. By the end of the first day, the results were evident. The garden was beginning to transform, and with it, Kevin's life as well. His new boss, Mr. Thompson, was impressed by Kevin's meticulous work. "I've never seen anyone work like this, Kevin," Thompson said one afternoon while inspecting the renovated garden. "Where did you learn to do this?" Kevin, still struggling with his English, replied humbly, "I've worked the land all my life, recalling the days spent in the fields of Haiti. I like taking care of plants, giving them life." Thompson nodded, admiring the simplicity of his answer. "You have talent, that's for sure. I'm going to recommend you to some friends. I think you could get more work if you're interested." Kevin accepted the offer without hesitation. That was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. With each new client, he became more well known for his ability to transform neglected gardens into beautiful spaces. He worked on luxury properties, paying attention to every detail with dedication. Although the work remained physical and demanding, Kevin felt that he was finally building something of his own, something he could be proud of. Over time, Kevin began to receive more requests. Wealthy families in the neighborhood trusted him to keep their gardens immaculate, and soon, word spread about his skill. It wasn't just about mowing lawns or trimming bushes. Kevin had a special eye for design and aesthetics. He knew how to combine plants and create patterns in the soil, giving each garden a life of its own. One afternoon, while finishing up planting flowers at a large property, Mrs. Johnson, one of his most loyal clients, came out to speak with him. "Kevin, you always do a wonderful job here," she said with a kind smile. "I've been thinking, have you ever considered starting your own business?" Kevin looked at her in surprise. The idea had never crossed his mind. For him, work had always been a way to survive, to build a life in a country that wasn't his. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "I've never thought about that." Mrs. Johnson observed him for a moment before speaking again. "You're really good at what you do. You could hire people to help you and expand your work. There are many families here who would pay well for someone as reliable as you." Her words resonated in Kevin's mind for days. Could he really aspire to something more? Until that moment, his only concern had been making a living and sending some money back to Haiti. But now, the possibility of having something of his own began to feel more real. It was true, he had the talent, and the demand for his work was growing. As he continued working, that idea started to take shape in his mind. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that, but Kevin was used to challenges. He had come to an unknown country, started from scratch, and was now beginning to build a stable and honest life. The possibility of having his own business didn't seem so far-fetched. A few months after that conversation, Kevin decided to take the leap. With the money he had saved, he bought some better tools and hired 2 co-workers to help him with the larger jobs. Little by little, his small team began to gain more clients, and what had started as a simple job to survive was turning into a real business. One afternoon, while resting after a long day of work, Kevin reflected on how far he had come from the dusty streets of Haiti, where he had grown up with nothing, to the luxurious mansions of the United States, where he was now building something of his own. His life had taken an unexpected turn. However, despite all the success he was beginning to achieve, he still felt that shadow within him. The emptiness that had accompanied him since he lost his brother remained there, silent but always present. Even though he now had a stable life, there was a part of his story that still felt incomplete. But for now, Kevin was focused on his future, working every day to build a better life, unaware that fate had plans to reunite him with what he had lost so many years ago. Kevin arrived early that morning. The sun was already starting to warm the air as he entered one of the largest mansions in the city to tend to the gardens. It was one of those sporadic jobs he had landed thanks to recommendations from his previous clients. But something about that property made him feel an unease he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the overwhelming size of the house, or maybe it was just the summer heat wrapping around him. As he pulled his tools from the car, he rolled up his sleeves and began to work, carefully trimming the bushes that surrounded the imposing facade. Everything was silent except for the distant song of some birds and the sound of the pruning shears cutting through the branches. Focused on his task, he barely lifted his gaze, trying to perform his work with the precision and dedication that always characterized him. But something suddenly distracted him. Kevin stopped. Something had caught his attention. Through one of the upper floor windows of the mansion, he saw something that made him freeze instantly. There, standing and looking out the window, was a man who appeared to be himself. For a second, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, as if he were seeing a reflection in the glass. But it wasn't a reflection. That man wasn't mirroring his movements. He was looking directly at him, as if he were equally surprised. The shock was instantaneous. Kevin dropped the pruning shears, his heart racing and his hands trembling. He stared at the man who was his exact copy. How was this possible? It was as if he were looking at his own face, but in a completely different world. Thoughts flooded his mind, fragmented memories of his childhood, of his lost brother. It couldn't be. But it was. That man was David. From the window, David had also noticed Kevin. His fixed gaze, filled with confusion, reflected the same disbelief that Kevin felt. Who was this man in his yard? Why did he look exactly like him? Without hesitation, David left the room and stepped into the garden. As he walked toward Kevin, his mind struggled to process what was happening, but it found no logical explanation. When they stood face to face, the tension in the air was palpable. The two men stared at each other, silent for what felt like eternal minutes. There was no denying what they both saw, they were identical. It was as if time had stopped, and everything else in the world ceased to matter for a moment. Kevin's breath was heavy. His mind still fought to grasp the truth. How could it be that, after so many years, he was standing in front of his twin brother? Who are you? David asked, his voice cracking with confusion as he took a step closer to Kevin. Kevin swallowed hard, still unable to believe what was happening, and tried to find the right words. I'm the gardener, he said, attempting to hide the tremor in his voice. But both knew that this conversation couldn't end there. David frowned, still bewildered. I'm not asking that, he replied firmly. How is it possible that you are me? Kevin lowered his gaze for a moment before raising it again, knowing he couldn't avoid what was coming. Finally, after all these years of doubt, of emptiness, he was face to face with the missing piece of his life. My name is Kevin, he said, mixing nervousness with determination. I was born in Haiti, in an orphanage. I lost my brother when we were children, and I think that brother is you. The words fell like a blow to David. His face paled. He stepped back, trying to process what he had just heard. A brother? A twin? None of this made sense. Throughout his life, he had grown up thinking he was an only child. He had never heard anything about a brother, much less a twin. But now, standing in front of him, was this man who not only shared his face but also a story that began to fill the empty gaps in his own life. How is it possible that no one ever told me anything? David murmured, more to himself than to Kevin, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had been incomplete his entire life. Kevin nodded slowly. He knew how difficult it must be for David to take it all in at once, but he also knew he couldn't stop. He had to tell him the truth. I grew up in an orphanage. Our parents died when we were young, in a conflict in Haiti. They separated us when we were babies. You were adopted by a family in the United States. I was never adopted. I stayed in Haiti, and I spent my whole life wondering if I'd ever see you again. David didn't know what to say. Everything that Kevin was telling him was a story completely foreign to the life he had known. He had grown up in a comfortable home with loving parents, surrounded by opportunities, and yet he had always felt a strange sensation that something was missing. Now, in front of him, was the answer. That emptiness he had felt his whole life had a name: Kevin. I didn't know, David whispered, shaking his head. They never told me I had a brother. I never knew anything about you. Kevin understood. He couldn't blame David for something he hadn't controlled. Life had separated them without either of them having a say in the matter. I don't blame you, Kevin said, taking a step toward him. It's not your fault. I didn't know if I'd ever find you. I came here seeking a better life, and I never imagined I'd find you like this. David looked at him in silence, his mind still trying to put everything in place. But there was one truth he couldn't deny: they were face to face after so many years. Fate had brought them together in a way neither of them could have imagined. What do we do now? David finally asked, his tone a mix of hope and fear. Kevin smiled faintly, a smile that reflected all the lost time and, at the same time, a new possibility. I guess we start by getting to know each other again. The weeks following Kevin and David's reunion were marked by an avalanche of emotions and discoveries. For David, the revelation that he had a lost twin brother was not only shocking but devastating on many levels. He had grown up believing that his adoptive parents had always been transparent with him, that his life was built on a solid foundation of trust. But now, that trust was wavering. One afternoon, David decided to confront his adoptive parents. He needed answers, and he needed them immediately. He knocked on the door of his father's study, where he was always found working. I need to talk to you, he said, entering without waiting for a response. His parents, surprised by his serious tone, exchanged glances before nodding and indicating for him to speak. Why didn't you ever tell me I had a brother? David asked, his voice loaded with a mix of anger and confusion. The silence in the room was absolute. His parents exchanged glances once again, but this time, the discomfort was palpable. They knew this moment would eventually come, but they had never imagined facing it so abruptly. David, his mother began, with a soft and conciliatory tone, what we did was for your own good. For my good? David retorted, raising his voice. Was it for my good to be separated from my brother, to leave him behind without telling me anything? His father sighed, finally intervening. When we adopted you, we knew we couldn't take both of you. It was a difficult decision, but we thought it was best for you. We could offer you a better life, but raising two children, it would have been too much. David took a step toward them, incredulous at what he was hearing. Too much, he repeated bitterly. And what about Kevin? What happened to him? Didn't you think about what his life would be like? The silence that followed was enough for David to understand the truth. They knew. They knew Kevin had been left behind in Haiti, that he had grown up alone in an orphanage while they offered him everything a child could desire. They had coldly decided that one of the twins would have a better life, and the other simply would not. It was never an easy decision, son, his father said, trying to soften the impact. We thought it was best for everyone involved. For everyone except for Kevin, David responded, feeling his trust in them crumble. How could you make that decision? We're brothers. Twins. His mother tried to approach him, her eyes filled with tears. We thought you would never find out, that you would grow up happy and that this wouldn't affect you. David stepped back, distancing himself from her. Happy, he said, almost in a whisper. How could I be happy with a life built on a lie? The conversation abruptly ended as David walked away, unable to bear hearing more. He felt betrayed. His whole life had been based on a version of reality that was now crumbling before his eyes. And worst of all, that truth didn't just affect him, it also affected Kevin, his own brother, someone they had left behind as if he didn't matter. Meanwhile, Kevin was also grappling with his own emotions. The reunion with David had brought him a mix of relief and resentment that he didn't know how to process. On one hand, he had finally found his brother, the missing piece in his life. But on the other, he couldn't shake the deep anger he felt at the thought of how their paths had been so different. One night, while Kevin was working in his small apartment, he decided to talk to his friend Samuel, who had been one of the few people he kept in touch with since leaving Haiti. "I can't help but wonder why I was the one left behind," Kevin said, his voice heavy with frustration. "Why did I have to grow up in that damn orphanage while David had it all?" Samuel, who had always been a good listener, looked at him with a mix of understanding and sadness. "There are no easy answers to that, Kevin," he replied. "Life is never fair. But look at what you've accomplished. You've made it here on your own. That's something few can say." Kevin nodded, although his friend's words didn't ease the resentment he felt. No matter how much he wanted to feel satisfied with what he had achieved, he couldn't stop thinking about what his life could have been if he had been the chosen one. Would he have had the same opportunities as David? Would he have been happier? Those questions haunted him every night, and none of them had a clear answer. In one of those confusing days, Kevin decided to talk to David. They needed to clear the air between them. They agreed to meet at a cafe, a neutral place where they could talk without the burden of their respective lives. "It's not easy for me to accept all of this," Kevin said, breaking the silence after a few awkward minutes. "I always thought that if I found you, everything would be easier. But now that I know the truth, I can't help but feel angry." David looked at him with a mix of guilt and sadness. "I know, Kevin, and you have every right to be. But I didn't know anything about this either. I was never told I had a brother. If I had known, what would you have done?" Kevin interrupted, locking eyes with his brother. "Would you have come to find me? Would you have tried to help me?" David fell silent. He didn't know what to say. The truth was that he couldn't change the past, and any answer he gave now would only seem empty. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "But now that I know, I want to get to know you. I want to understand everything you've been through." Kevin sighed, knowing that this conversation wouldn't offer him the peace he sought. But at the same time, he recognized that despite all the pain, he finally had his brother in front of him. And although resentment still lingered, there was also a sense of relief. He was no longer alone. "I guess that's the only path we can take now," Kevin said with a small smile. "We can't change what happened, but we can try to understand each other." David nodded, hopeful that despite everything that had gone wrong, they could find a way to rebuild what life had taken from them. The weeks that followed the reunion between Kevin and David were an emotional roller coaster, difficult for both to process. Although the desire to know each other was there, the scars of the past were deep, and none of their conversations seemed to flow without an undercurrent of discomfort. Kevin, who had borne the weight of a life of hardships, couldn't help but look at his brother with resentment. It wasn't David's fault, he knew, but it was impossible to ignore the fact that while he had worked from childhood to earn every little thing, David had lived surrounded by privilege. For Kevin, the luxury in which David had grown up felt almost like a silent mockery of everything he had lost. On the other hand, David, though filled with guilt, didn't know how to navigate that feeling of disconnection with his brother. He wanted to reach out to Kevin, to understand him, but every time he tried to empathize, he found himself facing an invisible barrier. There was a part of him that simply couldn't fully grasp what his brother had endured. His life had been comfortable, easy in comparison, and now he found himself in a position where that comfort seemed like an obstacle to getting closer to Kevin. One afternoon, the two brothers decided to take a walk in a nearby park. The atmosphere was relaxed, but the tension between them persisted. Neither of them knew how to break the ice. "I never understood how hard your life was," David began, breaking the silence. His words were sincere but, at the same time, clumsy. "I don't want you to think I don't care, but I don't know how I can make up for everything you went through." Kevin, who had heard these kinds of words in his head many times, took a deep breath before responding. You can't make it up to me, David, Kevin said bluntly. And I don't expect you to. What happened, happened. I grew one way, you grew another. But that doesn't mean it's easy to let it go. David nodded silently, absorbing the reality of what Kevin was saying. He knew there was no way to compensate for the years of suffering his brother had endured, but that didn't mean the guilt didn't torment him. I want to know more about you, David said, shifting the focus of the conversation. About what you've lived through, about Haiti. Kevin looked at him for a moment, weighing whether he was ready to truly open up. Talking about Haiti wasn't easy, not because of the memories, but because he always felt that no one would fully understand what it meant to grow up there. However, seeing the sincerity in David's eyes made him relent. Haiti is a place you can't forget, Kevin began. Not because it's easy to live there, but because everything is intense, the heat, the poverty, but also the people. Even when they had little, you always found someone willing to share what little they had. David listened intently, trying to imagine a world completely different from his own. When we were little, after our parents died, I don't remember much beyond the orphanage. It was a place full of children but empty of any affection. You had to fight for every scrap of food, for every little bit of attention. And I always wondered what had become of you. Kevin paused, searching for the right words. I never stopped thinking that maybe you had the chance I never had. David looked down, the guilt weighing on him like a stone. He didn't know what to say to ease his brother's pain, but he felt that for the first time, he was beginning to understand. I was never told anything, Kevin, David said, his voice breaking. If I had known you were there, I would have searched for you. But I had no idea they had left you behind. Kevin nodded, holding no resentment this time. I know. And I don't blame you for that. But still, I can't help wondering how everything would have been if we had grown up together. David swallowed hard, processing the weight of those words. It was something he had thought about since he discovered the truth. The lives they had lived could have been so different if the decisions of others hadn't torn them apart. There was so much to feel guilty about, but David knew he couldn't change the past. I never thought much about Haiti, David admitted. My parents told me I was adopted from there, but I never felt curious about my origins. Now that I found you, I feel like there's a part of me that has always been disconnected, and it has to do with you and the country we left behind. Kevin smiled slightly, surprised to hear that. Haiti is still a part of us, even if we've left it behind. Kevin looked at David with a serious expression. You may have grown up here, surrounded by luxury, but a part of you will always be tied to that place. David fell silent, absorbing what his brother was saying. In a way, he knew Kevin was right. Throughout his life, he had always felt something was missing. Now he was starting to realize that this absence was not only due to the lack of his brother but also to the disconnect from his roots. Over time, the tension between them began to fade. While there was still an emotional distance, they started sharing more moments, truly getting to know one another. Kevin recounted small anecdotes from his childhood in Haiti, the times he played with other kids in the dusty streets, the days when food didn't arrive at the orphanage, but there was always someone willing to share what little they had. Those were bitter memories, but there was also something tender about them. David listened in silence, taking each word as if it were a piece of a story he had never known. In his mind, those stories were like fragments of a puzzle that, little by little, helped him understand who he really was beyond the life of privilege he had known. I'd like to go to Haiti someday, David said, surprising Kevin. To see the place where we were born, to see everything you're telling me about. Kevin looked at him with a mix of surprise and approval. He hadn't expected David to be so willing to reconnect with his origins, but at the same time, he felt it was a necessary step. It won't be easy, Kevin warned. Haiti isn't like what you know here. But if you're willing, I think it would be good. They both knew it wouldn't be a simple journey, either physically or emotionally, but it was a step toward understanding, toward a relationship that, though scarred by time and distance, still had the potential to heal. Over the months, Kevin and David began to forge a bond that, though fragile, was growing stronger with time. It wasn't an easy process. Every conversation brought with it a mix of complicated emotions, painful memories, and reflections on what could have been. However, both knew that if they wanted to have any kind of relationship in the future, they needed to move beyond the past. Little by little, they opened up to each other, sharing their hopes and fears, their life experiences, and the details of the vastly different paths they had taken. Kevin, who had initially been filled with resentment, began to realize that David was not just a privileged man who had lived an easy life. Although their upbringings were completely opposite, David also carried his own shadows, his own unanswered questions. Not everything in his life had been as perfect as it seemed, and his quest to understand who he was beyond what his adoptive parents had told him consumed him. For his part, David, after months of reflection, began to see beyond Kevin's toughness. What he had once perceived as a distant or aggressive attitude, he now understood as a consequence of a life marked by struggle and survival. Kevin's resilience, his ability to move forward despite everything, was a quality that David could only admire. The true turning point for both of them came when David, after much internal contemplation, made a decision that would change the course of their relationship. One afternoon, while they were walking through the city, David suddenly stopped and looked at Kevin with a determination he hadn't shown before. "I want us to go to Haiti," he said without preamble. Kevin looked at him, surprised, not knowing how to respond immediately. "Haiti?" Kevin asked, although deep down he already knew David was serious. "Yes," David replied firmly. "I want to go with you. I want to see the place where we were born, to truly know your story, not from a distance, but being there in person." Kevin listened in silence. There was something in David's voice he had never heard before, a mix of conviction and vulnerability. He hadn't expected this proposal, but at the same time, he felt it was a necessary next step. Returning to Haiti wouldn't be easy, not after all those years of absence, but something inside him told him he had to do it, not just for himself, but also for his brother. "Okay," Kevin finally said, nodding his head. "Let's go." The trip to Haiti was transformative for both of them. From the moment the plane touched down, Kevin felt a flood of emotions he hadn't experienced in years. Seeing the dusty streets again, the vibrant chaos of the city, and feeling the scorching heat of the Caribbean sun transported him back to a part of his life he had left behind but never forgotten. For David, everything was new.